Hello, everyone. My name is Alexis Rogers, and I'm the Customer Relationship Lead here at RightCapital. And I want to welcome you all to our webinar today on strategies for optimizing education planning. And so today in this webinar, we're really going to be focusing on pinpointing that key topic for a lot of clients' minds, whether they're looking to ensure that their children's or their grandchildren's education expenses are funded. We're going to walk through how we can really capture these different strategies in RightCapital within their plan. So we're going to walk through our dedicated education module and how we can use that to create custom strategies to analyze and compare what does it look like if the student goes and gets more scholarships, or if we actually increase the cost of college, especially for those that might not be knowing exactly where they're going yet. If we wanted to illustrate and see the difference of those different types of college costs, we can use the education module in other parts of RightCapital to do so. So we're going to walk through how we can model those different strategies. We're going to walk through all the different key visuals that we can utilize to really connect the dots as to which route might be better resonating with the client. And we're also going to walk through if we want to implement our education strategy in our proposed plans, we're going to walk through what that looks like as well. As always, we're going to be covering the different resources that you do have within RightCapital. One of those resources being that during this webinar, if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the questions drop down and type out your questions there. More than happy to answer any questions you might have, but please feel free to use that questions menu drop down for anything that you might be wanting to cover. And so shifting gears into RightCapital, today we're working on the Holmes family. And we're going to start in the profile blueprint section. Profile blueprint is just going to be summarizing what the current path looks like for this client plan before we dive into the analysis of some of the outputs and looking at their children's college goals. I want to cover what their current path is. So in the blueprint module, we can see this nice, easy to understand visual of what their current net worth is. They currently have $2.4 million in their net worth, including their primary home. But an important factor here, and as you can see, the clients are currently in their early 50s. They do have 2 children that are prime and about to be entering college age. And the 2 children do have 529s respectively that are already built up. So $75,000 for Watson Jr., $65,000 for Cecilia, and that's going to come into play, of course, when we're looking at the outputs for education planning. As for the client's goals, we do have a nice vacation goal coming up next year. And then we do have some college goals coming up for Watson Jr. He's reaching that age where he's going to be attending college. And if we click into the college card, when we are entering an education goal in the profile goals section or in profile blueprint goals, there's a couple different things that we can keep in mind here. We can establish when we expect for the child to be attending college, what ages, what time frame. We can also incorporate any planned scholarships or grants in this card entry right here. Same thing with student borrowing. If we wanted to assume that the student is going to be borrowing a certain amount for their college goal, we can enter that here. And when we enter information into this section, we are impacting the current plan. In this situation for these clients, in the current plan, we're really just going to be strictly focusing on the idea of the college goal happening with just the 529s that we've got in mind and pulling from other sources to fund these. But what's going to be key here for our knowledge base, when we're entering a college goal, we do have a couple different options for how we choose to incorporate the cost of college. We can either use a national average, and from the national average dropdown, there's of course a couple different paths that are taken when it comes to college goals, whether we're looking at just an associate's program, we're looking at a graduate program, looking at getting master's, things along those lines. We also can incorporate the difference of in-state on campus or out of state on campus, nonprofit 4-year on campus, which can be a little bit more expensive. And we have a couple other national average for masters as well. So there's a couple different options for national averages if we're not sure exactly where we're going to college, but we want to, of course, account for the college goal itself. And we can, of course, enter a customized amount. This can be particularly beneficial if we know that we're targeting a specific amount that the client is going to be funding for this goal. If that's the case, we can enter what that amount is. In this case, though, for these particular clients, we're going to be looking at a specific college. We know where Watson Jr. is looking to go. So we're going to select the specific college drop down, which will allow for us to use the college lookup tool. From here, we can then search for our specific college. In this case, of course, the Holmes family is extremely smart. So we're going to be going to Harvard for Watson Jr. So we're going to select Harvard here. When we use the college lookup tool, this is pulling in costs from the Department of Education, which was recently updated with the new information that came out from the Department of Education board. When we select a specific college, we have the option for either in-state costs or out-of-state. In this case, there's not much of a difference for Harvard, of course, but they are in-state, so we're going to select that and hit save. And that'll then pull in the hefty cost of Harvard. So when we're entering the current path for the college goal, there's a couple different ways we can capture that information. For Cecilia, she is attending a specific high school where she's going to be having to pay, or the parents, of course, are going to be having to pay for some pre-college costs, which is why we have a pre-college cost card here. So within the pre-college goal, when we add this particular goal, we can enter when it's going to start, when it's going to end. In this case, it's only for the next 2 years of her lifespan that she's going to be paying this extra amount for the pre-college goal. For them, it's $12,000 a year, but as we know, education goals can vary pretty drastically. And for Cecilia's college goal, she is going to be going to Stanford on the West Coast. So that's the specific cost that we're pulling in for both of the children. And as for the parents, we have just a pretty typical retirement plan, retiring at 67 and 70 respectively. They do plan on downsizing when they retire. And as for their current income, savings, and expenses, they have some pretty decent income coming in. Going to be, of course, taking Social Security at age 70 as late as possible, and they're pretty avid savers as well. Which is going to bring us to looking at our education planning. So now that we have that current path outlined and how we can also modify the current path as needed, under the education goal, this is going to be where we can start to analyze the different funding analysis for each of the college goals and pre-college goals as well. Within the education module, we're going to see a tab dedicated to each person with a college goal, for Watson Jr. and Cecilia in this case. For Watson Jr., we can see this nice visual here in terms of how much of his college goal is currently covered from his 24% and how much dollar-wise we're falling short for funding his college goal. Especially when we're looking at some of those Ivy Leagues, Harvard can be pretty hefty in the cost. So as you can see, the total cost of the education is pretty large when we're looking at all 4 years, considering how much it's going to be inflating with our education inflation assumptions. But that is when we start to look at our action items to start to curate our proposed strategy. So within the action items, this is going to be a space that will allow for us to really customize and fine tune what is happening with the education goal, but also the different paths we might be taking in terms of looking at how to fund this education goal. The first thing that we can adjust here is going to be kind of making changes to the actual cost. So this is where we can see what it looked like if they went to a higher costing college, maybe a less expensive college, or if we wanted to incorporate the idea of Watson Jr. having some sort of scholarship. As we know, the Holmes family is pretty smart, so they're probably going to get a scholarship. If we're looking to incorporate that idea, we can just enter that figure into this field right here. And let's say we want to assume that they're going to receive $8,000. And if we did want to do the same thing for student borrowing, assume that he borrows anything, you can use the slider to indicate so. In this case, though, we're only going to be incorporating the scholarship. We want to assume that most of it's going to be paid by the family, just to make sure that this money is set aside and guaranteed for their education goal. But we know based off of Watson's applications, he's already received a scholarship that's guaranteed. We're going to incorporate that here. The next thing we're going to see is going to be just a check-in as to what the current balance is for the 529 that is marked as dedicated to Watson Jr. For his 529 balance, he's got $75,000 already established there. The remaining sections here are going to be where we start to indicate our proposed path for how we might be wanting to start to fund that 529 additionally. So within these acronyms, we can indicate two different types of savings that are populated here for us. The first one is a lump sum saving. This means that it's going to be a one-time contribution this year into the 529. The second option right here is going to be where we can indicate an additional annual 529 savings that is made each year until they go to college. So let's say in this case, we want to make a lump sum savings. The family does want to put aside $10,000 into the 529 this year for Watson Jr. because he's getting very close to his college goal, only 2 years away, basically almost one at this point. And we do want to incorporate the idea that they save additional money into the 529 each year. And that's when we're going to start to layer some of the savings with the additional annual 529 savings card. So in this case, we're going to be indicating $15,000 additional annual 529 savings. We're going to hit the refresh button to see how much that will go to be funding their education goal. Another thing that we can incorporate here when it's an important aspect of 529s is the asset allocation. So here we can also change what we're looking at in terms of the asset allocation for the 529, especially if we're looking to have them going to a different portfolio. In this case, their 529 is pretty moderately, or I should say conservatively invested. So if we're looking to have it be a little bit more aggressively invested, see how that's going to impact their returns, we can see how that will impact their education analysis as well. For strategies, we also can analyze what does it look like if we incorporate different funding sources to fund this education cost. So right now what we have selected is 529 only. This means we're only going to be pulling from the 529 balance to fund this education goal, but we have a couple different options from this drop down in terms of what we want to use for funding their education goal. So we can also look at using the 529 and taxable brokerage account. We can look at the 529 taxable and Roth accounts, all resources except 529s, and then all resources if we're just looking to ensure that this is funded and we're okay with that. In this case, we're going to be focusing on the 529 just for this particular analysis. So we're going to leave this as is. But as you can see, we do have some funding shortfall that is still happening for this plan, especially as we notice that we are pretty close to that end date. That's maybe when we're going to look at putting some extra money aside for the education goal this year. So especially if we see that we have the surplus that we can set aside to the 529, that's when we can devote more to that lump sum saving to indicate that one-time lump sum going towards the 529 this year. As we're talking about what this visual looks like, if we wanted to see a breakdown of a little bit more of a balance sheet layout of what is happening with what we're indicating for our proposal, that's when the details tab comes into play. The details tab is where we're going to see two different types of pieces of information. The first one being the education cost summary, where we can see for each person with the college goal, for Watson Jr. and Cecilia. For Watson Jr., we can see what's happening with the education cost each year. We can see we have that scholarship goal that's guaranteed each year, the net cost. We can also see that 529 funding coming in. We can see the total funding, and then we see that shortfall happening the last 2 years. From this dropdown, we can view what is happening with the 529 summary, and this is that second piece of information. So we can see that growth that's happening with the 529. We can see those savings. We can see our additional annual savings, the withdrawals, and the ending balance per year. So in this case, they are comfortable saving more into this education goal, up to $19,000. So we're going to indicate so. And in this case, they are comfortable pulling from the 529 and taxable, but we just wanted to see how far their 529 would take them. In this case, if they did pull from their taxable investments, they would be able to fully fund this education goal. For Cecilia, she's got a little bit of a different circumstance. She has a pre-college goal considered and her college goal as well, which means that we're looking at a little bit of a different predicament for her. When we have a pre-college goal, right now what we have indicated for our settings is that we will use the 529 to fund that pre-college goal automatically. And this is going to be considering that federal limit that can be applicable of the $10,000 limit for pulling from a 529 to fund pre-college goals, which is why we're seeing for the first 2 years for those pre-college goals, $10,000, and then the rest is going to be considered a shortfall. Since we have a pre-college goal, we're going to see 2 fields for her particular action items. We're going to see one for the pre-college goal and then one for the college goal for when she actually goes to Stanford. And once again, we can make those modifications if we're going to be assuming that they're going to have some sort of scholarship. In this case, she does have a little bit of a scholarship for the pre-college goal, and we can do the same thing for the other entries as well. Before we dive into some of her analysis though, there's an important assumption we want to keep in mind for if we wanted to exclude 529s from looking at pre-college funding. If that's the case, because I already see this as a question, that's when you navigate to the gear icon settings section. Here under methodology, at the very bottom on the left-hand side is going to be where we can check off whether or not we want to assume that we're using the 529 accounts to fund pre-college goals. So if we're not looking to use the pre-college, that 529 savings for the pre-college goal, we can deselect this, hit save, and we're now going to see under education for Cecilia that we're no longer tapping into the 529. It certainly varies case by case. In this situation, we are not going to be using the 529 to fund the pre-college goal because they have already set aside that taxable brokerage savings. They're comfortable pulling from that taxable account to fund their pre-college goal. They already have had that path outlined for a little bit, but the 529 is really dedicated to her college expenses. With that in mind, we do have some extra time for savings for Cecilia, and that's really when that additional fields come into play. So for Cecilia, we are comfortable making a lump sum, $32,000. And we can also make an additional annual 529 savings contribution. And for her, we're going to be a little bit more aggressive, and we'll hit refresh. And we can see we already have 53% of the goal covered. And this is, once again, considering the idea we're only pulling from the 529 to fund this education cost. And we can also look at what it would happen if we had a little bit more of an aggressive portfolio if we wanted to. We wanted to actually go into a growth portfolio as opposed to what we have currently, or if we wanted to go to more aggressive, anything along those lines. In this case, once again, they both have scholarships, so we're actually going to change this particular piece right there, which is of course going to impact her education cost summary. And under details, we can switch this particular drop down to Cecilia's education cost summary to see what's happening with her plan. Same thing for her 529 summary. We can see that lump sum going in, those contributions going into their 529 as well, and that slow withdrawals from the accounts. An important thing to note, because I also see this as a question, if we do have an overfunded 529 for Watson Jr., for example, and Cecilia goes to college after him, we will waterfall the 529. So if Cecilia has a college goal after him and there's surplus 529 savings in his account, it would go towards funding Cecilia's automatically. So there's no sort of check mark we need to indicate that. That's not the case for Watson Jr. though. He is pulling from the taxable and the 529 to fund his education costs, which is okay with what they have planned. And we're going to assume the same thing for Cecilia. So in this case, for both of these children, we are looking to solely tap into the taxable assets and the 529s to fund their college and pre-college goals. And when we're ready, now that we've established this particular education path, we're going to navigate to the retirement module. And under analysis, this is where we're going to be greeted with that first gauge of financial well-being, which is the probability of success. This is looking at the Monte Carlo simulations, or the 1,000 trials of market volatility, and it's the percentage of those trials that make it to the end of plan without running out of money. So for both their current path and their proposed path, they both have 100% probability success. But of course, there's a lot of different paths we want to ensure that we can capture and analyze for a client plan. And that includes what we just had as our education goals. So in the action items, this is where we go to start to curate our proposed plan. Already we have a couple things in mind for the Holmes family. They have that goal, of course, of retiring earlier. We do have them saving a little bit more with the idea that they're going to be retiring earlier. So that's going to be a little bit of a difference between our proposed plan and current plan. But under strategies is where we can start to pull in some of the different strategies we've created in the dedicated modules of RightCapital. In this case, what we were looking at was the education strategy. So we've already curated our education proposal, and we want to make sure that this is baked into our proposed plan. So we're going to click on the current strategy drop down here. We're going to select education proposal. And once we hit refresh, we're going to see how that's going to impact the probability success at all. For them, it's a good sign that it didn't negatively impact the probability success. But I want to note that there is this green bar chart right here. This is going to be looking at the median trials ending asset value from those 1,000 trials of market volatility. So it's going to serve as that kind of benchmarker for where the trials end up. So we did see a slight impact there, which is a good thing compared to the idea that we are going to be retiring a little bit earlier in this plan, and we still can guarantee that we're funding the education goals, the pre-college goals for the children as well. So this is going to be one of the first key visuals that we're going to look at here. The probability success comparison is always great, but we do have another type of comparison available, which is of course found under the comparisons tab. So under the comparisons tab, this is going to be looking at a different type of projection. This is going to be pulling from the cash flow level projection. Cash flows are going to be looking at a straight line projection, which means it's a guaranteed return and is not factoring in volatility to the baseline projection. You will see the option from this drop down though to apply different sequences of return. So if we did want to see what it looked like in terms of how their invested assets fare, if we assume that we have a bad decade followed by slow growth for returns, or maybe worst case scenario, flat 0% return, you can see those different kinds of comparisons and how that's going to impact their plan. Right now, though, we're going to be focusing on the baseline, but under this comparison visual, we can see the difference of invested assets between the two plans. We can also see the difference in net worth over time, the difference in taxes paid for them in this plan, and what we have already is going to be paying less in total taxes than their current plan. We also can view the comparisons of assets at retirement as well. Like I said, this is considering a couple of other factors. If we wanted to reset back to the current plan, we can click on the reset button, and that'll essentially just bring it back to the baseline current path, which we can do pretty easily by hitting reset. And then we can reapply that education proposal. So if we did want to isolate those different plans and how it's going to impact their probability success, or maybe the comparisons tab, we can isolate that comparisons. So we can see even if we just isolated the education proposal versus no education proposal, we have more ending assets in the baseline. We can view what's happening with taxes, net worth over time, which is all vital pieces of information. Same thing for that probability success and that median bar chart, still not negatively impacting their probability success, which is a good thing. If we go to the retirement cash flows, this is where we're going to see a little bit more details as to kind of what we were looking at in the comparisons visual. So in cash flows, we're going to be greeted with our maps visual. This is going to be targeting a specific year of the cash flows into a nice visual format for us. Right now we're looking at 2037, but we can use a slider to focus on a different year. In this case, we want to focus on 2026 because that's when we do have the pre-college goal for Cecilia and the college goal for Watson Jr. But we can see what's happening in terms of distributions. This is going to be the 529s, the salary that's coming in, and where it's going to be funding. Things like the education goal, additional plan savings, and so on and so forth. In this case, though, we want to go to the summary. This is where we're going to see the actual line-by-line breakdown of their cash inflows and cash outflows. So if we wanted to see in the cash flows what is happening with the education proposal that we just baked into this proposed plan, we can do so by just drilling down into each of these column headers. We can see exactly what's making up the plan distribution. It's those 529s, of course. And we can see those goals, the education goals themselves. We can see Cecilia's pre-college goal, Watson Jr.'s college goal, Cecilia's college goal happening after she graduates from high school. And we can also see what's happening each year with the surplus cash flow. And this is also a great place to see if we do have available surplus cash flow to continue to save into the 529s. So as you can see, especially for them and their circumstances, they do have a lot of extra surplus cash flow that they can devote towards paying for additional 529 savings. So this can be that great resource to really check to see what's happening with future years. And maybe that's when we go back to the education module and we're going to start to save more to each of these, especially for Watson Jr. His college goal is coming up a lot sooner. So maybe that's when we're going to start to save a little bit more for him. Let's change the funding sources to 529 only to see exactly how much of his college goal is covered with the savings. And maybe we can save a little bit more. And maybe that's when we do the same thing for Cecilia. Change it to 529 only. And we're going to save more for her plan as well. And so especially for her, because she has a lot of extra time, it's covering a lot more of her plan. But if we wanted to see what's still happening in the retirement projection, we can go back to retirement to the cash flows. And since we do have the education proposal turned on in the retirement analysis for the proposed plan, all the changes that we just made are automatically applied to our proposed plan as well. So we can see what's happening with the savings. Still have some surplus cash flow, which is good. So we could even save more if we wanted to. But we can still, once again, see what's happening in terms of the education goals. Same thing with the distributions from the 529s. We can see what's happening there. The accounts tab is going to be where we can also see what's happening with the 529s and their ending balance by accounts. But it's also where we can see what's happening with all accounts as well. So we can also see net cash flows. So if we wanted to see the contributions and then the withdrawals at the end of each year, we can see that information from the accounts tab of the cash flows as well. So similar information can be found in the cash flows as we might find in the education module, but the education module is a lot more targeted in terms of how we view the education goal, because it's really going to be focused on just the 529 and the education cost itself. So in this case, we're going to turn it back to 529 and taxable because that is what they are comfortable doing. But now we've just built out more of the 529. And if we even wanted to, we can even illustrate the idea of them putting more into the 529s if they're comfortable. But for now, we like what we have built as our proposed path. And if we wanted to see similar information that we saw in the cash flows, under the details tab, we can see that education cost summary. And especially because we do have taxable and 529 selected, we're going to see 529 funding here, of course, until that becomes depleted. Once the 529 is depleted, that is when we're going to be looking towards the taxable assets to fund the education goal. In this case, we're pulling $71,756 to be going towards Watson Jr.'s education cost, which we are comfortable with, so that's good. We can also view the 529 summary, what's happening there with savings and withdrawals. Similarly for Cecilia, we can see what's happening with her projections for the 529 and also her education cost summary. See us pulling from the other funding for the pre-college goals, which is what we intended. Same thing for when her 529 runs out, we can see that other funding coming in, which is just $17,000 in 2031. So we can see a lot of really helpful information here. But once again, going to the retirement module and then into cash flows is going to be where we can see the full breakdown of their actual inflows and outflows each year to gather more information. But it's also where you can go in the accounts tab if we're looking to see exactly which accounts we're pulling from to fund some of these different education goals, anything along those lines, we can see that information from here. I want to note that especially with this particular family, as they do have a large surplus of cash flow each year, since we are of course pulling from the 529s first, when we do have 529 and taxable indicated, if we do have extra inflows that can go to fund the education goal, it will go to fund the education goal prior to us tapping into the 529. So right now we are going to be showing that their goals, they are fully funded right now considering the 529 and just their surplus cash flow each year alone. So that's why we're not going to see any sort of withdrawal from the taxable accounts. But if we didn't have any surplus cash flow or inflows to cover these expenses, that is when we pull from just the 529 and the taxable as indicated. I want to note, if you did want to modify education assumptions and just to cover what we are currently using for some of the education cost inflation figures for this plan, we can modify that and view that by going to the gear icon settings section. And under other assumptions, this is where we're going to see what we're using for global assumptions. Right now we are using 5%, but if we did want to utilize customized education inflation assumptions just for this client, we can do so by clicking on this drop down right here, selecting customized assumptions. And maybe this is when we have unique assumptions just as client. So we did want to modify that, assume less aggressive growth for these particular education goals for just this plan. We can do so from here, which we're going to do so for this client. And then we can see how that's going to impact their total education goals, things like that. Because I did see that that was a question, especially for Harvard and for Stanford. They are pretty costly, but they're not necessarily growing as rapidly as some of the other colleges. So if that's the case and we know exactly which college they're going to, we know how much on average their college costs are growing each year, might be a good opportunity to use that customized education inflation figure to really be a little bit more in tune with the college. But of course, we are using global assumptions until we make the modification to indicate otherwise for the individual client plan. But now that we've walked through some of these different outputs, the next thing we're going to be looking at is going to be under the gear icon report section and curating a report of what we just inputted into the education module and retirement analysis. So once we're ready, under the report section, we are going to be able to include the education visuals we have, those charts, and also the details as well by just clicking on this box right here. And we can choose to include the analysis and cash flows. With analysis, this is going to be an underlined option for us. Anytime we see something underlined in RightCapital, it's going to be a key indicator. We can click into it to see additional information or additional functionality. For the reports case, this allows for us to be really selective and really intentional in terms of the reports that we're curating. So in this case, we want to focus on just the helpful visuals for the education analysis. So we're going to deselect confidence. We're going to be looking at the probability and action items. We are going to be looking at savings analysis. So we're going to leave that in, but we're not going to be focusing on retirement. You do have the option to toggle the select plans. So if we did want to include multiple proposals and the current path, we can do so from there. In this case, we only want those two, so we can leave that deselected and hit done. And similarly for cash flows, a lot of great information in cash flows, but we don't necessarily want to cover all of this, especially because we're solely looking to analyze the education funding that we just did. So in this case, we're going to be focusing on the maps. We are going to include the summary. We're not including net worth and invested assets. And maybe this is the case where we just include withdrawals from accounts, ending balance by accounts, and net cash flows. And once again, for the cash flows, you can toggle the select plans. So if you did want to include multiple plans cash flows at once, you can do so from here to compare and contrast especially. And we can also include the blueprint in this report as well. And then once we're ready, we can hit the download selected pages. And if we like what we have curated here, we can click on the save new template option to maybe save this as an education funding template. So that way going forward, when we go to curate an education analysis or report, we can use that from this drop down. And that'll deselect and select everything for us and rearrange the different flow we might have established if we did rearrange the PDF report.